From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Democrats panic about Joe Biden's age, but is there anyone else in the party who could fill his shoes in 2024? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial writer Monet Ukwe-Barua. Welcome to you both. Suddenly, it can be said in Washington that Joe Biden is no spring chicken. Last week, there were articles in the New York Times and the Atlantic with Democratic sources making the argument that President Biden should not run again for president in 2024. But the White House still insists that he plans to do just that. Here's a clip of CNN's Don Lemon speaking with White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
The president have the stamina, physically and mentally, do you think, to continue on even after 2024?
Don, you're asking me this question. Oh my gosh, he's the president of the United States. I can't even keep up with it. We just got back from New Mexico. We just got back from California. That is not a question that we should be even asking. Just look at the work that he does. Look how he's delivering for the American public. Look, that article that we're talking about is hearsay. It's salacious. That's not what we care about.
Kim, to start with, what do you think explains the sudden breaking of this omerta on talking about President Biden's age?
Can I just say, now they tell us, right? I mean, no one was allowed to even walk up next to this subject the entire time he was in his basement during the campaign season. Now here we are, and the answer to me is incredibly obvious, which is the poll numbers are terrible. And the party's in a lot of trouble. And what are they going to do? They'd like to be able to blame this on Biden's age, that the notion that he is off by a step. And that's a little frustrating in a couple of levels. Again, I wish they'd have told us all this earlier, but also it's a little frustrating too, because it's such an obvious attempt to blame it all on his age and potentially thereby allow them to not confront the reality that actually it's mostly their policies that are causing the problem, although having a president who's not maybe as vigorous as he might be is also an issue too.
But just to provide some numbers to compare, before President Biden, the oldest president in office to date was Ronald Reagan. He was 3 weeks shy of 78 when he left the Oval Office. Second oldest was Donald Trump at 74 and a half. And then we have 70 for Dwight Eisenhower and Andrew Jackson, not quite 69 for Harry Truman and George H.W. Bush. And now we're talking about President Biden will be 82 in 2024, which means he would be 86 at the end of a second term. And Monet, I'll just throw to you a quote from Jimmy Carter. Here's him speaking in 2019. He said, quote, "If I were just 80 years old, if I was 15 years younger, I don't believe I could undertake the duties I experienced when I was president," unquote. And we know that medicine is getting better all the time. Lifespans are getting longer. And yet being the president of the United States is a pretty tough job.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I think the signs of Joe Biden's age have been apparent to everyone for quite some time. Sort of the forgetfulness, which sometimes is of a benign nature, forgetting the lines or stumbling in a speech that he's reading, but sometimes it leads to sort of really important potential gaffes. And we saw that when he essentially changed United States policy toward Taiwan in an impromptu fashion and forced the State Department and Defense Department to come in and kind of clean up after him by reiterating that the policy hadn't changed. So Americans are increasingly being exposed to the signs of Joe Biden's age and are seeing how it's affecting his performance. But I really do think that sort of the change in tone with how Democrats are treating this has a lot more to do with what Kim was saying. Joe Biden is sinking in the polls, and so they know that he probably is going to have to decide whether he does want to run again in 2024 within the next few months, and they want to try to float the narrative that he isn't fit in order to try to gently persuade him to decline to seek a second term. And so we'll see whether that argument is persuasive to him. I'm sure that he's feeling the exhaustion of having to be out sort of crisscrossing the country and the world at his age. I think he's a very proud man and has shown himself to be so. And so it's quite possible that he might let pride get the better of him and decide to run again at all odds. And maybe the conversation around his age is even making him more likely to run again. But either way, that's part of the agenda on the part of the Democrats who are floating these criticisms of his age.
I'm of two minds about this, though, because on one hand, when you're in the White House, you're in a real bubble surrounded by people who admire you and think you are the answer to the nation's problems. And it's also hard for any person to admit new limitations on them. There's an element of trying to take away Grandpa's car keys in this. President Biden wouldn't be the last or the first guy to hit some limitations and not want to acknowledge them. And so on one hand, maybe he really does intend to run in 2024. On the other hand, even if he were wavering in that or having doubts about that decision, I think the White House would still present a united front that, of course, President Biden intends to run for re-election because he doesn't want a Democratic primary to start taking place behind his back. And he doesn't want to be viewed as a lame duck president that people on Capitol Hill don't need to curry favor with. Kim, what's your read of this decision? And do you think he really does mean that he intends to run in 2024?
So I think I take a slightly different view on this. I get your point about the lame duck, but I was always of the belief that the best thing Joe Biden could have ever done, which probably would have won him an even a greater victory had he said it when he was campaigning the first time, was I'm going to be a one-term president. I'm here to be a caretaker president in a way. The country's been through some real turmoil with the virus. And he did talk a lot about restoring some normality to the country after 4 years of the ups and downs and political fights over Donald Trump. I still think that he could do that now. And in fact, were we to get a Republican House and Senate, he would have an opportunity to say, I'm not going to run again, but what I am going to do is use my last 2 years to get some stuff done and unlock himself from the leash of the progressive left and work with members of Congress. He's always bragged that he's a deal maker and get some kind of modest, if incrementally better policy done. I also find that almost impossible to believe he would do that. But if the pressure continues to mount on him, that would arguably be the smartest way forward.
But if he doesn't, that raises the question of who can fill his shoes. And Monet, it seems that the Democratic Party does not have a lot of great answers to that question right now. I mean, the obvious choice would be Vice President Kamala Harris, but she seems to be pretty unpopular. There was a poll last fall that gave her a 28% approval rating. And let me just read a little bit from a news report this week. It says, Vice President Kamala Harris was slated to host the Democratic National Committee's major money-hauling event, the annual Women's Leadership Forum, on May 25th. But the event was rescheduled at the last minute for autumn, when the event is traditionally held after the DNC couldn't sell enough tickets, unquote. And so, Monet, I mean, do you think that Kamala Harris would be the heir apparent if President Biden decided to bow out, or do you think there would be a real fight in the Democratic Party for who gets the nomination?
Well, I think that there are probably some Democrats and, frankly, some people in the media who would try to circle the wagons around Kamala Harris. Obviously, it's kind of expected that the vice president should be in pole position to succeed the current president. And there are people who still remain excited about the possibility of her becoming president, in no small part because she is a woman and because she's black. But I frankly think that the voters have already rendered their opinion on Harris's viability. She really underperformed in the 2020 Democratic primary, despite having a lot of press attention around her, kind of trying to prop up her candidacy. And frankly, since she's been vice president, her popularity has only sunk. I think people have really not taken to her style and found her to be quite underprepared in a lot of her public appearances. And so it's not surprising to me to see that she's polling very lowly. So I frankly think that there are a lot of Democrats who would try to come in and challenge her, but there really isn't a very clear alternative. You hear a lot of buzz around Pete Buttigieg, the transportation secretary. He's still, I think, obviously quite young and doesn't have a ton of national experience and didn't perform super well in the Democratic primary in 2020 himself. And so it's possible that his candidacy could pop, but it's not by any means a sure bet. And you're right to say the Democrats don't really have the deepest bench right now, either in the progressive lane or in the more moderate lane. there isn't anyone who seems to combine sort of great charisma with an existing national profile and a lot of experience. So it would probably be a very, very brutal, drawn-out, open contest to see who might succeed in taking over for Biden.
The other dynamic that I think is fascinating about this, Kim, is the dynamic between President Biden and President Trump. Because President Biden may think that he's the only candidate who can unite the Democratic Party, as he did in 2020, and defeat President Trump. And so he may decide he needs to run if President Trump is running. On the other hand, if President Biden says he's running, President Trump may not be able to resist a rematch and trying to get some vindication for 2020. And so it seems like there's a little bit of a game of chicken going on here, where these two guys are eyeing each other and trying to figure out if either or both or one of them is going to run in 2024.
I completely agree with that, especially on the Donald Trump side of this. If you talk to people who remain in contact with their former president, he apparently remains very mercurial on this question of if he's going to run or not. One day he gets up and he is, and then another day he thinks not. And there's been discussions in his own arena and group of people about his own age, too. He's not exactly youngish either. But apparently, when you talk to these people, the days when he is most excited about the notion of doing another run, feels most engaged in that idea, is when anyone brings up the possibility of either a Biden second term or a Hillary Clinton return to the party. And it's just apparently a very personal thing, which shouldn't surprise anyone with Donald Trump, that, you know, he would feel almost obliged to go and try to win back his honor, as it were, by beating Joe Biden or by, again, defeating Hillary Clinton. Whereas it sounds as though he'd be a little bit more willing to maybe step back and instead play some sort of kingmaker role if it was a different candidate. I'm sure that same thought process is going on in the White House. I think Renee made a really good point that Joe Biden is not a man without a certain high level of ego and pride. Many politicians are. And, you know, he could well feel as though it's his obligation, especially if Trump were to get in, to beat him a second time.
Well, that would be fascinating to watch, Monet. But if we end up with a Donald Trump versus Joe Biden race in 2024, somehow I think there's a pretty good chunk of the electorate that would prefer to turn the page and pick somebody like Ron DeSantis on the Republican side, or maybe an outsider like Governor Gretchen Whitmer on the Democratic side.
That's very possible. I think that, yeah, America will roll its collective eyes if they see sort of a matchup of the same, fairly older candidates, people who have had a shot at the presidency before. And in fact, between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, it would be a couple of guys who have been the president before. And yet, I think that probably if you were to look at early primary polls at this point, both of those people would lead their respective fields. People tend to go with familiar brands. People want a certain amount of experience. And I think that the reason that Joe Biden was nominated in the first place in 2020, despite a lot of the media being against him, is that people wanted someone who was tried and true and, was a little bit older and a little bit more experienced. And so I do think that there would be a lot of merit to sort of taking a chance on a younger candidate who was trying to turn the page on some of the worst excesses of their parties. I think that both of the names that you mentioned, DeSantis and Whitmer, would qualify in certain ways under that definition. But I definitely would not discount the odds of either Biden or Trump sort of prevailing over their fields. I think that a lot of voters in both parties remain loyal to those folks, and that it would be really hard for somebody to try to challenge them.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Meanwhile, in Alaska, we finally have results on a Republican primary in the special election for a U.S. House seat. And one of the top contenders moving on to the general election is former Governor Sarah Palin. Kim, can you just give us a sense of what's going on in this race, and particularly how these strange new Alaska voting rules seem to be working?
Yeah, so just a little bit of history here. Going on 2 years now, the Alaska voters had an initiative on their ballot to fundamentally restructure their voting system. Now, a lot of Alaskans have since had buyer's remorse. This initiative very narrowly passed, and we're talking just inched over the finish line. And only then, because the outside groups that had really pushed for this was really kind of foisted on the Alaska ballot and really supported by a bunch of outside kind of good government types. But they were very clever, and what they did is they presented this initiative as largely about transparency, when in fact the real ballot initiative was almost entirely about getting rid of partisan primaries and having what they call a jungle primary, where everybody is on the same ballot together. And then the top 4 candidates out of that then advance to a ranked choice voting system. And in adopting this, Alaska became only the second state to have a ranked choice voting system. So this is the very first exercise of it. Note that this is only a special election to fill the final months of Don Young's term. So it would be from August until January. Alaska is separately gearing up for another primary in August and a general election in November that would fill the term for the following 2 years. So the state's going to be going through this again in just a couple of months.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, and they say that there are no second acts in American life, but it would be interesting, Monet, to see Sarah Palin in the House. I mean, she's done a lot of things since the McCain presidential campaign and then leaving as governor. I guess I'm a little bit surprised that she's leading the field, the primary field at least, although we should also say that special elections can sometimes be odd ducks because the number of voters, the turnout is different than they are in general elections.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I'm surprised to see her leading the primary field. I mean, she has remained visible in American politics since she kind of first emerged on the national stage in 2008. I think that her reputation has probably risen and fallen sort of across the times, and she has become sort of an object of personal fascination, and I think people have followed the Palin family and their travails probably as much as they have followed her involvement in politics and her political stances over the past several years. She's a familiar name, and I think people want to potentially see her returned to the national stage, and to have her enter Congress would make sense. But yeah, you're right to point out that special elections do draw a kind of skewed crowd, and so it's going to be the most motivated and passionate voters who are showing up to them. So whatever the follow-up elections, if she is elected, might have a little different bent than what we're seeing.
Well, Kim, what's your sense of the general election here as we move toward it? What are the issues the candidates running on? And do you think that Sarah Palin is in as good of position for that as these initial 4-person primary results seem to suggest?
Yeah, I do think that that is the case. For some of the reasons that Monet mentions, she's well known. She got Donald Trump's endorsement as well, too. And people, for all of the criticism that was leveled at her on the left, and to the extent that some people, even on the right, lost some confidence in her, she still got quite a loyal fan base in Alaska. People who remember that she did good work when she was governor. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out in this special election. There were 48 candidates on the ballot. Remember that Alaska only has 1 congressional seat, and they had to do this special election in an unusual way. They did it all by mail-in ballot because they were rushing to get it gone. Because if you think about this, because Alaska only has 1 congressional seat, it is currently completely unrepresented in the House of Representatives now that Don Young passed away. So there was a real urgency in the state to get this done and get somebody into place. I think, interestingly, though, I think Palin could end up having a little bit of a fight here with the other Republican who did quite well in this race, Nick Begich. She had 28%. He had 19%. And then I think that there's also a very interesting dynamic because no one really understands how ranked choice voting will work. But there's a pretty well-known Democrat who was running in this as well, Al Gross. He, several years ago, ran a campaign against U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan. He lost that, but he certainly got a lot of name recognition out of it. And, you know, usually in Alaska, much like other states, it can often be a Republican and Democrat. You know, in the end, usually Republicans are favored, but not always. So this will just be fascinating to watch, to see how people make their second choices and how this all works in practice. I still think this special election and the general election could toss up some big surprises.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. And we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.